we just heard that the present is the key to the past. Well, I'm going to reverse that, that the past is sometimes the key to the present. So first of all, 3 very basic facts. The first is that elections are not free-for-alls. They are a complicated set of rules written by state actors determining who can vote, when you vote, how you vote, what is a valid vote, who counts the vote, who certifies the vote. And the construction of those rules, quite obviously, affects the electoral fortunes of politicians. Not surprisingly, the parties and interests have an incentive to write the rules in their own interest. Basic fact number 2. The United States is not the most democratic nation on earth. World Audit, just if you want a quickie web source to look up, ranks the United States as 16th. Then most scholars have it somewhere in that. Now, there are 150 some odd countries listed. So the US is in the top group, but we're certainly not number 1. There is limited participation by registration rules, by weekday voting, by limits on resident aliens. Ex-felons can't vote in many states. Despite no taxation without representation, there's Washington, D.C. and the overseas territories. So the United States does not rank especially high. And similarly, there's very bad seat-vote ratios. We expect the party that gets a share of seats, share of vote, should somehow get an equivalent or approximately equivalent share of seats. And the Electoral College, House gerrymandering, 2 senators per state, all violate seat-vote ratios. The third basic fact is although the United States was, in fact, the most democratic nation through the 19th century, it's considerably, exaggerated to assume that our history was wonderful and peaceful and benign and that everything worked well. There was extensive corruption and considerable violence. Oh, I love telling stories. In New Jersey, in the first congressional election, the Federalists kept the polling places open for weeks in areas where they expected votes. And as soon as they had a majority, ran to the counters and said, "Count now!" There was also a district in New Jersey a bit later on, 1807, that had an electoral turnout of 279%. There's a county in Maryland where the dominant faction didn't like the outcome. So it canceled the election results, moved the polling place to the house of one of the loyalist supporters, mobilized the militia to surround the house, got a favorable outcome and said, we'll keep that one. There are many, many such stories. But the point is that, well, certainly overwhelmingly women and African Americans could not vote in early America. But the thing rarely realized is that only about 2/3 of adult white men could vote. And the major restriction was the property qualification. That in all of the 13 British American, North American colonies, at the time of the Revolution, they had a property qualification. You had to own a freehold. In real estate, almost always, sometimes not. Either of a certain value or usually of a certain size. The first state to remove the property qualification was Pennsylvania in 1776. The last one, North Carolina, in 1857. So it's 3/4 of a century of intense politics. And it didn't go easily. And there was lots of controversy. And the question is, why would a set of sitting politicians elected under current rules change the rules that elected them? Wouldn't that be irrational? It's already considered a democratic society, far more than any other in the world at the time. And so what gave them incentive to change the rules? We'd love to believe that they did it because they were benign people who sort of, believed in the democratic ideal and the democratic thrust of the revolution. No. I wish it was. The property qualification was a sign of permanent stakeholding in the community and a guarantee of independent judgment. So voting was a corporate right, corporate privilege. You owned in the town was like owning part of the corporation. And you got stakeholding in the community and independent judgment because you own property. So Benjamin Franklin tells a story of the man who owned a jackass, giving him $50 in value and therefore qualified him to vote. He learned a lot about elections and voting and gained all the experience he needed to be an expert voter. The problem was, before the next election, the jackass died and he was no longer qualified to vote. And so Benjamin Franklin asked, "Now, gentlemen, pray inform me, in whom is the right of suffrage, the man or his ass?" But this is a major step in transforming voting from a corporate privilege into a human right. And so we should investigate it. The hypothesis is that electoral reform occurs only when and to the degree that it benefits incumbent politicians, and thus political party consolidation and competition is the main explanatory variable accounting for property qualification over the 3/4 of a century. In some states, the radicals won power and expanded the franchise to prevent the conservatives from organizing. In Pennsylvania, for example, where they literally stole legislative authority from the elected state government. Or in New Hampshire, where the townships resented centralization, or Georgia, where they didn't want control by Savannah and the plantations. Much more often, conservatives won power and expanded the franchise just enough, and just reluctantly enough, to split and divide their mounting Jeffersonian opposition. There's a number of states. The modal path was that a traditionally out party won a surprise election and then quickly moved to expand the franchise, anticipating that the benevolence of the newly elected would carry them and keep them off. Let me tell you a Connecticut story. It's a religious politics story. I'll do it quickly. The Congregational Church, the Puritan Church in Connecticut, basically made a deal and then screwed the Episcopalian Church. And the Episcopalians in 1816 got so angry that they joined with the Jeffersonian opposition. Now imagine this, the Church of England allying with the pro-French political party. They won a surprise election, and suddenly the Jeffersonians expanded the franchise, and the Federalists never won another statewide election again in Connecticut. But before you say, oh, but it's nicely democratic, you've got to remember they didn't expand the franchise, so those people not expected to vote for them. So New York State, the Van Buren faction won a surprise election, controlled the Constitutional Convention, expanded the franchise for whites, but they kept it for blacks because blacks were voting Federalist and therefore couldn't be relied upon. And then there's one state, Rhode Island, that had a revolution. In 1842, Dorr's Rebellion, there was a people's constitution that had a people's election and elected a people's governor that went to take the armory. And the state didn't like it very much. And of course, Dorr's Rebellion ended in disaster, but the state then compromised enough to restore civil peace. This is not a story of benign democratic expansion. So what does it mean for today? If the hypothesis is correct, we should not expect electoral reform unless it advantaged some political party, and that party had the political means to carry it out. And so let me give you just simple examples. The motor voter bill, where you could register to vote in DMV, you could also register to vote at certain social welfare offices. And this would favor the Democrats and not the Republicans. George Bush Sr. vetoed it. Bill Clinton, when he got in with a sufficient majority, passed it. It's not because one party was humane and the other wasn't. They counted votes. Washington, D.C. Even though the population of Washington, D.C. has voted overwhelmingly to become a state, it's never going to become a state. Washington, D.C. is heavily African American, votes overwhelmingly Democratic, and Republicans are not going to allow 2 more Democratic senators. And given it's so hard to change the U.S. Constitution, 2/3 vote in both chambers of the legislature and 3/4 of the states, there's no way Washington, D.C. is going to get no taxation without representation. Or the current picture ID for voting. And there's lots of very good literature on this. There's almost no effect on voter fraud, just about 0. There's enormous effect in discouraging turnout, especially among minorities and overwhelmingly among African Americans. It is therefore no surprise that the states that have been at the forefront of pushing over voter IDs are those that have Republican governors, and especially those that have moved from having Democratic governors to Republican governors. And the Democrats scream. Perfect. Conclusion. A sobering lesson. Franchise reform is associated with human rights. We want to believe that, oh, another page. Here we go. We want to believe that inclusive democracy is essential to individual empowerment and to responsive and responsible government. Yet the progress of democratization sits largely within the domain of officials elected under the existing rules. And therefore, for all the language of social justice, franchise expansion always has depended critically upon the efforts of organized factions to achieve electoral gain. Their strategic perspective might be short-sighted. The effects tend to be quite long-lasting. Future democratic reform in the US, as in the past, will most likely rest contingent upon the dynamics of partisan politics. And in politics, the lesson goes, profound changes are often achieved as a consequence of far more mundane motivations. Thank you.
Questions for Ron? Tom?
I hope I've annoyed somebody.
So when are we going to get rid of the Electoral College?
We're never going to get rid of the Electoral College. And it's very simple. Until recently, oh, here we go. Until recently, no political party had an incentive to get rid of it because until very recently, for almost 100 years, the popular vote outcome and the electoral outcome were the same. Now we're never going to get rid of it because the Republicans have learned that twice in recent years they have won the presidency without the popular vote. And so given that it's almost impossible to change the U.S. Constitution, and given that you need 3/4 of the state legislatures, and far more than a quarter are under Republican control, we're never going to get rid of it. Now again, don't blame Republicans. If it were switched, the Democrats would be playing this role. Sorry. Al.
Thanks, Ron. Nice optimistic view there. I'm wondering what role the Supreme Court might play in this, in the sense that if you had a Supreme Court, if somebody brought a case that showed clearly the Constitution was being violated with taxation without representation, in the case of Washington, D.C., could they force the issue and require them to become a state or do something?
Here my cynicism is overwhelming. The Supreme Court follows the election returns. Not always. And sometimes, as in the current gerrymandering case, they might stretch just a bit. But on the whole, for example, no taxation without representation is not in the Constitution. And for the voter ID, the large numbers of circuit courts have upheld voter ID, despite the fact that they are clearly discriminatory. In fact, very conservative Justice Posner, one of the Chicago School, wrote a scathing dissent attacking voter ID as discriminatory. And it was a dissent. He was outvoted by his colleagues. So I have, to join the political science department on a scale of 1 to 100 of cynicism, you have to score 200 or above. Go.
All right, this is totally off the wall. But right now, the election in Kenya is very interesting. And it ties back to some of these issues that you talked about relative to change in electoral process in the U.S. Could you comment on how you imagine that process going in Kenya?
Here I'm going to punt. What I know about the Kenyan election is what I know from skimming newspaper stories. Obviously, the result was thrown out, but I do not know any of the politics. I do go back and forth to Eastern Europe, and I know some of the people who wrote the Romanian Constitution, and they had a bunch of social scientists sitting next to them when they figured out how to write the electoral laws. So that's as much as I can give you. I'm sorry. Okay. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Ron. Am I correct that in territories like Puerto Rico right now, they can vote in primaries but not in the actual election, and what is the rationale for that? How
A
would that
primary-
advantage particular parties?
A primary is a private arrangement of a political party. And so they can write their own rules. On the other hand, so no one is elected to official government office. It is an internal private arrangement of the party.
But why would they want the territories to participate?
Oh, why would they want to? I think it looks good. I think it sounds
Oh.
good. They don't have many delegates. They're not at the margin influential in any way. It's a sign of inclusion. But when it comes to actual...
Okay, so this is counter to what you were just
But
advocating,
within
that there
the
are
party-
some things that occur for inclusion, whatever
Well, I
reason.
mean, because it has no marginal impact.
Okay.
So it's tame. It has no impact at the margin. It's not going to threaten anything. But when it comes to actually electing people and therefore changing the balance of power and decision making, they're on the outside. Of course, that's exactly what the United States was, a colony on the outside. So, but again, when you study political science, you don't expect consistency.
What's the number one Democratic country?
Oh, it shifts. I think right now it's Netherlands or Norway. New Zealand is very high. Denmark is reasonably high. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.